I want my great-grandchildren to come here. I want them to be proud of where they're from, proud of who they are, proud of the history of their families and the achievements of our people, the intelligence of people, the knowledge of people, the science of people in my community. So I want that hall to reflect that reality, that there's a different way to think about the world around you.
Regularly, on a daily basis, museums are more receptive to the idea of emphasizing object biographies and understanding the chain of custody associated with the acquisition of objects, um, and also reconciling how many of those objects were acquired through avenues that were not necessarily, they may have been illegal, but they were not necessarily, it may have been a legal um, acquisition, but it may not have been an ethical acquisition.
Humans have been fascinated with what came before them for centuries. The ancient Greeks coined the term museum, which were spaces created to honor the muses who resided over the arts and sciences. They would fill these spaces with art, sculpture, and people, such as philosophers, who are researching the world around them. As global trade routes were established and Europeans began exploring the New World, they started collecting items they called curiosities, establishing personal, private collections in rooms often referred to as wonder rooms. As years went on, people who had wonder rooms started to open them up to the general public. The name cabinets of curiosity became more popular. However, many of these so-called cabinets objectified cultures, skewed the truth, and valued money and entertainment over education and truth. One of the most popular examples is P.T. Barnum and his live curiosities. In the United States, indigenous groups suffered the most from these curiosities. Places such as the Museum of Anthropology at the University of California created a precedent for having live exhibits. This opened the avenue to places such as zoos who had Native American enclosures, as well as the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, which displayed different cultures and people. And while many establishments claimed educational purposes, it was really a display of what was seen as different and exotic from white Western American culture.
People are not collection items. Funerary objects should not be collection items. And reconnecting indigenous people to their ancestral territories, and rectifying past injustices associated with misguided archaeological and anthropological data collection and excavation is rewarding. And I find that to be especially important to me.
In the early 20th century, the United States began passing laws that would protect natural and cultural resources. The first law passed was the Antiquity Act of 1906. It provided general protection to natural and cultural resources, but only those on federal lands. It also protected archaeological sites located on federal land that frequently experienced looting and required all artifacts found at these sites to be accessible by the public. Because many archaeological excavations in the United States were not on federal land, they were not protected. Many scholars and institutions exploited this idea and encouraged people, mainly amateur archaeologists and collectors, to loot these sites and bring artifacts and remains to their institutions. The most notorious contributor to this was Alfred Kroeber, an anthropologist at the University of California. Under NAGPRA, or Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, which was established in 1990, the law requires institutions to repatriate or return human remains and other funerary objects in their collections. Many universities and other institutions have poor records indicating the cultural affiliation of human remains and funerary objects. They then use this poor record keeping as a loophole in the legislation to continue to remain non-compliant with NAGPRA. More than a century later, how are museums and different cultural institutions addressing their past? What changes are they making to ensure indigeneity is properly represented in these spaces?
What were previously referred to as archaeology exhibits, that's not a term that we're using any longer. We're referring to this gallery as an indigenous peoples gallery, with a kind of early settlement transition as we move towards the end of it. That early settlement transition is also meant to emphasize removal, which is something that was often overlooked in most museum exhibits that involved Native peoples. We've made a concerted effort to make tribal representatives and their knowledge the center of the exhibit rather than the objects the center of the exhibit as it was in the past. So in doing so, it means that we are addressing topics that are generally overlooked in other exhibits, like removal, but also things like Indian boarding schools, also the forced assimilation programs and the governmental relocation programs. It is our goal to tell the whole story rather than telling a redacted story, which has commonly been the preferred way of addressing indigenous peoples in archaeological and anthropological exhibits all over the country, not just in the Midwest or in areas where Native Americans were forcibly removed.
As museums wrestle with this idea of indigeneity and how to represent Native peoples in their spaces, the idea of colonialism has become a popular topic of discussion among many museum curators.
But inherently, the act of involving marginalized communities that were marginalized by conditions associated with colonization, by lifting up their voices and prioritizing their knowledge, certainly means that there is an emphasis on incorporating decolonization as a part of this exhibit and other exhibits too.
As museums begin to work towards decolonizing their spaces and make changes that reflect the wishes of the cultures and tribes they are representing, the museums and heritage sites that continue to resist are becoming more obvious. They are receiving backlash for how they continue to represent indigenous cultures.
Depending on who you ask, these new guidelines from the state are either eliminating history for the sake of political correctness or allowing Native Americans to play the roles their relatives did long ago.
You are in the wilds of Westmoreland County as a detachment of British soldiers is ambushed by a group of Native Americans representing various tribes. It's part of the Battle of Bushy Run reenactment at the historic site just outside of Jeannette.
They've been doing this for 40 years. They keep history alive in our area. This is history. We want to reenact, we want to show people, we want to educate people. It's important. It's Western Pennsylvania, it's important history.
The guidelines also call for Native Americans to play the role of Native Americans who took part in the conflict, with scenes showing how Native American encampments were, as well as battle tactics with weapons demonstration.
What is happening here is we're bringing political correctness into history.
Keep looking. Find some Native reenactors, some indigenous people, some local indigenous people who actually are into the reenacting scene.
Miguel Segué Jr. of the Council of Three Rivers American Indian Center says the new guidelines are appropriate.
It's never good to have a bunch of people representing indigenous people who are not indigenous people, especially when they're doing something in public.
There are museums that are and will continue to make changes that reflect the wishes of indigenous peoples. These institutions will continue to place their best foot forward and do consultation work in order to improve their collections and exhibits, ensuring that Native voices are being exemplified to their visitors. Other places will continue to resist. But through educational conversations and activism, these institutions, with time, will also be forced to change and comply.